want to just address real quickly how we came together for this particular project, which was funded through the Baldwin Foundation on the UW-Madison campus. I have been at the Space Science Engineering Center for 27 years, hard to believe, but also just a bit more of my background. I actually started out my career as a science and math teacher. And one of the things I will say about the GLOBE program is I wish it had been available when I was teaching. I really see it as an ideal foundation for us as a community to support our children in addressing the serious changes we're going to be experiencing in our environment in the very near future and already are experiencing. I also want to thank this group for having the courage to address this really as a moral, ethical issue. In putting together this proposal, Dr. Michael Notaro, who's the Associate Director for the Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies, his focus has been on science, whereas my focus in the Space Science Engineering Center has been getting the data that we archive and analyze out to the public in a comprehensible fashion, hence the education component. One of the critical aspects of this concept of climate change and how do we address this as a community has been our feeling that we cannot address this as a moral issue up front. And so Michael and I actually had a bit of a debate as to whether or not we should reference Laudato Si, which is the seminal encyclical by Pope Francis that really tries to address the upcoming consequences of global change. And we agreed that we should have the courage, the key being courage, to put this in our document, in our Baldwin proposal. And historically, it always takes a few tries for this particular program, so we were shocked and pleasantly surprised, and I was actually thanked by somebody on the selection committee for putting this in place. And I think that's something that we as a group all need to remember, and we need to get past this. Because in my experience, while I was at NASA headquarters, we literally could not use the term climate change or global change in many of the policy statements that we were putting out. Hence, I'm back here in Wisconsin. So, I mean, it really it was very problematic for the majority of us working at the agency at the time, and yet literally an individual his specific job, and this is in the early 2000s, was to go through every document, proposal announcement that we issued from our individual specialty offices and black out any reference to climate change. If you can, I was there. You may have heard the rumors, but I was there, and this was truly happening. And so this is why it's so important for groups like this, I think, to continue to move forward, and we need to have the courage to address these concerns with our children. So once again, I don't want to be too redundant because much of what is needed to be said has been said by the preceding speakers. But one of the main issues I focus on from the aspect of K-12 education is the lack of time actually devoted to climate change education and environmental education in the typical classroom. And this was brought out in a Pew report, I believe the year was 2016, that only 55% of high school teachers felt adequately prepared to teach about the topic of climate change, and even more disturbing, only less than 30% of teachers at the K through 8 level felt confident or had adequate training in this area. And so someone earlier had asked, why have we been so stupid about this? And this is not a critique of the K through 12 education system at all. It simply hasn't been a part of the pre-service training requirements, not only in Wisconsin, but nationwide. And one of the things I was most stunned by when I was at NASA headquarters and getting a much broader perspective and traveling to multiple states was that this was a universal problem within this country. It wasn't simply Wisconsin. I was under the naive impression that maybe it was just our training programs here in Wisconsin. And so what we have really tried to do with the GLOBE program is provide some remedial type training for teachers so that they feel more confident about implementing programs like GLOBE into their classrooms. Our project summary requires 3 key partners. Once again, we are working with the educational community, and our goal is to inspire scientific place-based inquiry to advance climate science education and literacy. And our 3 key partners are, once again, Space Science and Engineering Center, where our primary task is collection of space-based satellite data, remote sensing data about the Earth, and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, the Center for Climate Research, which is an obvious partner. I was a bit surprised when I found out I was the only one that was walking upstairs to talk with the Nelson Institute, so that even in and of itself, it was a game-changing event. And also the Wisconsin Ice Age Trail Alliance. They have been leaders in land stewardship and implementing over 1,200 miles of trails across the state. Actually, my personal family farm property is part of that trail system, so if you go to the Lake Wisconsin area near Gibraltar, we're the Fern Glen Farm group, beautiful area that has been relatively undisturbed, and this is really how we became acquainted with what the Ice Age Trail folks do. And our main project objectives, once again, we'd like to expand the understanding of environmental issues by facilitating access to climate researchers. And this is a real issue with rural schools in that they barely have the resources in many cases to adequately support the teachers in the community as far as their salaries and so on. But they also lack immediate access to scientists like Michael and my other colleagues who spend a lot of time in classrooms within about a 50-mile radius of Madison. But once you get beyond that area, for example, the first scientist that had visited the Butternut School was Michael in northern Wisconsin. And so that in and of itself, having that experience of meeting a scientist and giving the students the opportunity to ask questions can have a major impact. And once again, it emphasizes the importance of us getting out of our immediate communities and providing them with the resources or that inspiration that can get students more engaged in these issues. And our second goal, of course, we do science. Our main task at the Space Science and Engineering Center is data collection and the analysis of data. And when we hear a debate in a community as to whether or not climate change is real or climate change is not real, we immediately know that at least part of that debate is not based on data. And so what GLOBE really brings to the table as an education program is the authentic collection of data. That's why this program is so close to my heart as a former science and math teacher. The third task that we'd like to accomplish is bringing teachers and citizen scientists into this program. We do not exclude members of the community from participating in this program. Just yesterday, before I took off, I spoke with one school in the Lake Wisconsin area who said they had 3 senior citizen volunteers who wanted to participate in our training this summer. We welcome that event. And in fact, as elders in the community, they have a long enough memory and perspective of the changes that have been observed in their immediate community and can bring a lot to the table. So we want this to be a community-wide effort with teachers being ground zero as far as bringing the science to the schools. And then student-directed research is another really critical element of good science and mathematics education. One of the ongoing questions that we heard is why, as a teacher 38 years ago, and even still this has not changed, students ask, why do we need to do the math? Well, how does this apply to anything in my life or the real world? And when they do GLOBE and collect data on the various protocols, it's like the lights go on. They suddenly realize how the math is applied in data collection, and it makes it real to them. And so this is a really important element of the program as well. And we want the students to collect their own data on locally relevant issues. For example, if they are observing a certain tree species that they've seen changes in over the last decade, they can identify a specific species such as birch that may be relevant to their particular community and develop a special measurement protocol that is scientifically based to monitor any changes in that species or a particular animal that's important to the community. So it is very flexible in that regard as well. And just want to focus a little bit on why we picked the Upper Midwest from a scientific standpoint. The Curtis Tension Zone is basically was identified by Professor John Curtis at UW-Madison in 1959 as an ecotone or a region where we begin to observe the transition between the southern deciduous forests and northern coniferous forests. And any of you who have driven from southern Wisconsin, Madison on Highway 151 or the interstate north can see a very drastic shift as you just north of Portage. You really can start to visibly see that change between predominantly deciduous species along the highway and transitioning into predominantly evergreens. And in fact, it was a little bit amusing for me to drive to Butternut last summer with Michael, who's originally from the Bronx in New York, and he had not ventured too far north yet. And I had told him how dramatic this was, even from the highway. I don't think he believed me. He was shocked when we drove north. But it really, even for him, brought home the fact that it is so important to monitor the transition, and this is actually something that is immediately visible to us as an individual person or as a community who has their location residing in these ecotones or zonal change areas. So we really want to emphasize the importance of this as well. And once again, a quick just reference again to our partners. The Ice Age Trail has been around for quite a few years. They really became very active about 25 years ago when they received some funding from the National Park Service when they became an office, which has helped that program quite a bit. So they're sponsored by the National Park Service and the DNR, and they have at this point, I believe it's over, just in the last flyer I received, I think we just passed over the 1,200 mile mark of trails across the state. The beauty of this is that the Ice Age Trail is roughly north and south and transects that Curtis Tension Zone. So for whatever reason, the light bulb went off in my head several years ago as a direct result of our family participating in the trail. And I realized that this crosses the Curtis Tension Zone, and it really is an ideal opportunity to work with schools and communities in that environmentally critical region where we're beginning to see significant changes in the transition of tree species from south to north. So basically our goals, we're going to collaborate with the Ice Age Trail and get access to their communities who are already very heavily involved in supporting Ice Age Trail activities. Our first program training was in Butternut, Wisconsin, which, if you're not familiar, it's just north of Park Falls between the Shawagamogan and Nicolet National Forests. Our workshop is already full as of yesterday. For the Cross Plains, Wisconsin training, we're picking locations that are basically accessible to schools. We don't get a huge budget for this, so we want the teachers to be able to, and community members to be able to comfortably drive to these communities events. And we're going to provide teachers and any of you who want to be citizen scientists with training. Our other goals are to promote, as I've already indicated, authentic science. Students doing research in the same manner as scientists conduct their research activities. And I'll talk about GLOBE specifically a little bit more in the future. We want to facilitate school and community access, once again, to the scientists at Space Science and Engineering and the Center for Climate Research, so that they can stimulate that interest in pursuing the future adaptation of their communities to the changes which we know without a doubt are going to be experienced. And once again, support authentic K through 12 scientific research projects that are relevant to communities. And I can't emphasize this element enough. In my future life, we did quite a bit of planetary science with observations and so on. And one of the key first things that we learned was that we needed to make this relevant to the students. They had to have a sense of ownership. And what greater sense of ownership can young people have than to realize this is going to impact their communities? It is going to impact their futures. And so by having that ownership, students are much more engaged in learning about climate change and environmental science. And getting them outside and collecting that data gives them ownership and participation in supporting future policy for their particular local and regional communities. And just a quick emphasis on the science. Once again, we've talked about the Curtis Tension Zone, and I think this is a more expanded image where you get a better feel for the current location of this ecotone. And the future projections are that it'll be cooler and moister further north. We're going to experience warmer and drier conditions south of that zone. And you'll note that Door County is in a very strategic location. Before I came up here, I talked with Michael about this particular presentation, and when he realized that you are in a very environmentally sensitive location, he's quite excited about the possibility of doing a workshop next summer in your area. This was roughly carved out by the melting of the Laurentian ice sheet, and I won't belabor that point, but it is a rather obvious the changes that impacted soil in particular really carved out that zone, because of course the soil is what provides nourishment to the vegetation cover and subsequently the animal species that inhabit those environments. And I want to touch a little bit on the distribution of tree species in the Curtis Tension Zone, and you'll notice some of the individual species that have been identified where their ecological boundaries are. And the most pronounced gradients are a direct result of snowpack persistence, frost-free duration, evapotranspiration, which is the loss of moisture for trees, and of course the soil type. And that soil type, once again, is very closely related to the location of the melting of that ice shield. But you'll see that many trees, their normal habitat is clearly transitioning, will be clearly transitioning north. And I just want to quickly address how Professor Curtis identified this low Curtis Tension Zone. He basically looked at the range limits for 182 different species, and you'll see a number in each one of the counties. And that number is tied directly to the total number of species he identified in those locations. And it was determined by the densest concentration of individual range lines there. So for a clarification as to how he did this, and this will, I understand, be online later if you want to take a closer look. There have been changes in the past. We frequently hear the argument, well, climate has always been variable. And we know that that is indeed the case. Much of Michael's research has focused on historic variability and changes in vegetation. We know this through identification of fossil pollen done through soil cores and in lake beds. We can identify stratified layers of different pollen species, so we know the concentration over time of various species. And indeed, there have been changes in the past, but nothing like what we anticipate in the future. And I think this is a particularly important chart. Eric really addressed this point earlier. If you look at the change from the late 20th century through and anticipated model changes based on computer models into the late 21st century, what you're seeing is a dramatic shift in what our landscape is going to look like at the current trends in climate change. And as you can see, this North Woods is rapidly anticipated to disappear. It's pretty scary. I consider this the most disturbing of all the charts that we've seen. And I just want to point out, this is not the result of the imagination of one person. This is multiple computer models that have been compiled that have projected this degree of change. And of course, some of the key species that we are interested in, boreal species like black spruce, quaking aspen, paper birch, and so on, there we are projecting reductions in suitable habitat. Some species are going to do very well, like American basswoods, which are almost considered weed-type trees, black cherry. They will likely be moving much further north. Many species that are currently common in northern Wisconsin and western upper Michigan are going to decline under hotter and drier conditions. And this will, of course, influence the productivity of our forest lands and the surrounding environments. And once again, we just picked 3 key species, and yet I see this as yet another very disturbing chart. If you look at these changes in 3 key species over the next 100 years. So climate change surpasses land use. It suggests that the changes will often occur first at the margin of a plant's occurrence. So once again, locationally, you folks are very important. You are at the margin of the ecotone, and so students participating in our program are unfortunately in a unique position to monitor these changes. And now I'm going to talk just a little bit more specifically about the GLOBE program. GLOBE stands for Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment. This was originally developed by Dr. Dixon Butler and Dr. Jim Davis at NASA headquarters. I had the privilege to work with Dr. Butler while I was there. And I always wondered why this program made so much sense as an aside, and I found out that both of them were married to teachers. So I think it really emphasizes the importance. I saw my job there as bringing together scientists and educators so that they could better understand what their unique jobs were and how they could better work together to improve science education. And so I always felt like a translator between the scientific community and the educational community. But I think that had a major, the fact that they were both married to teachers had a major impact on the overall quality of this program. The program has been around since 1994. in Wisconsin, we became involved as a direct result of participating in a NASA Langley New Millennium mission for an instrument called GIFS that would collect data on the water vapor column abundance. And so Wisconsin did not have a partner at this point, and we worked with NASA Langley to implement a program here in Wisconsin. Unfortunately, the mission was over budget, and so it is not currently operational, but it really, I think the positive outcome was that we now have a GLOBE partnership in Wisconsin. And it's an international program. We have, and I believe it's now 122 countries, this is a bit dated, that are involved. We have 125,000 students worldwide, with 80,000 teachers trained and over 10 million distinct sets of data from around the world that have been submitted into the archive that is at NASA Langley Research Center. It is a ground observation program. NASA does space, and so they have multiple satellites with instrumentation on board that collect data on the atmosphere, soils, surface conditions from space. But they need to calibrate those instruments. We need to know that the data that is being collected is actually accurate. And so the, once again, in my opinion, brilliant aspect of this is that we have actually been able to validate whether or not these instruments are functioning properly through ground-based data collection. Students have actually supported NASA in carrying out their mission. And so it's important, very important from a scientific standpoint. The GLOBE program focuses on 4 critical parameters. We look at Earth as a system. Students collect data about the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, biosphere, which is life, and of course the pedosphere, soil, which is probably the most neglected sphere. And I'm really glad that both Buddy and Eric talked a lot about this as well, because we recognize the importance of soils, especially in a state where farming is a very important part of our economy. And this just gives you some specific details about the types of measurements that are taken under each one of the specific protocols. The atmospheres one is the most popular, primarily because most schools do weather and climate in their schools, and so we actually provide an instrument shelter so that students can collect data on the daily high-low temperature, barometric pressure, and precipitation. That tends to be quite popular. The hydrology data is a little bit more challenging simply because it requires that some type of body of water be proximal to the school. That isn't so much of a challenge in the rural areas like we have in Wisconsin, where most schools and small communities will have a stream or a pond nearby. And so it makes it much easier. Where it is a challenge, we have actually done trainings in downtown Chicago. And so a drainage ditch becomes their hydrology collection site, but not surprisingly, they've collected some very good data, even in looking at the runoff from the surrounding areas. So it's useful even in that type of context. And of course, the pedosphere soils data is once again very critical to a state like Wisconsin. And this just goes into a little more detail about the atmospheric investigations. What is really, once again, critical about the atmospheric investigations is the fact that we have satellites that are 250 miles in space collecting data on a larger scale. But what GLOBE atmospheric protocols provide are a closer look at those local microclimates that vary considerably on relatively small scales. And one of the things we are beginning to see is that even on a small scale, climate change can potentially have a huge impact on a local economy, a local community. And we saw that really dramatically right before we did our introduction of the GLOBE program at Cross Plains this past spring. It was several days before we had that large flooding event in the Lodi area, and we had several teachers there from Lodi, so they had a very real and recent event that demonstrated what a huge impact climate change could have on a very local community. And the streets were flooded. It had never happened in the entire history of the community. And this was a direct result of the dramatic shifts in the weather in that particular location. And they'll probably be experiencing far more of these 500-year flood events on a 1 to 5 year basis, sadly. So it was very timely. It was, as we call, a teachable moment. The other, hydrology, once again, we do not have a lot of data from smaller local ponds and streams. This is also very important to monitor the health of our environment on a local basis, and this simply is not readily accessible from satellite data. So as a community, you are supporting our understanding from the bottom up as to what is happening locally during the changes we're observing in climate on a larger scale. Land cover investigations, once again, are extremely important from the standpoint of looking at individual tree species. The school in Butternut, Wisconsin has put together teams of students who have adopted small groups of trees, and they're monitoring the phenology, the bud burst event, timing of bud burst through leaf drop in the fall, which is critical to another program that I'll talk a little bit about later. And once again, I'm just referring to the soils data collection. This is something that has been seriously neglected, and GLOBE is one of the only educational programs that places an emphasis on collecting data about our soil to better understand the overall health of that environment. It tends to be one of the more difficult protocols to implement because, as you can imagine, it's chemistry intensive, but it provides a nice transition from the atmospheric protocols and hydrology protocols to the high school level, and the kids love to go out and get dirty, as you will, and it has become, actually, we found with the rural farming communities, it actually is one of the more popular protocols. And once again, our approach is basically to focus on working with the existing Saunders School programs that are part of the Ice Age Trail educational program. They have emphasized for the last, I believe they've been in place since 2004. And those schools which are adjacent to the trail have the privilege of being able to take hikes. It's wonderful this time of year. I know, I remember when I was a teacher, it was hard to sit in the classroom as well, but it really takes advantage of the existence of that trail adjacent to the school. And the students have been collecting basic observational data about plant species and tree species in the form of what we would call metadata without any analysis. And so our thought was that by implementing GLOBE in these schools that are already participating in the Saunders program, we can take the educational aspect of this to the next level and back to the classroom, where the students can actually utilize data that is based on well-defined protocols and data collection to enhance their existing science classroom experiences. And so I will use, once again, the Butternut School as an example, just because they were so optimally located between the two national forests. We have they really exemplify what we've learned over the last 20 years to be a model situation. We found that the smaller schools tend to be a lot more flexible in what they can incorporate into their curriculum. We find that the teachers all know one another and talk with one another on a regular basis, When I go into a classroom in a larger urban school, you frequently don't even have the science department and math department communicating with one another other than during some mandatory general meetings. And this is not the case in the rural communities. And so we found that they really are ideal for bringing this type of program into place. We have already trained Butternut and Park Falls. This year we're going to be going to, and I'll just throw out the schedule here, we're going to have the training at the Ice Age Trail main office in Cross Plains, Wisconsin, and we've brought on board one school actually has the entire staff. It's a small private school in the Lodi area. The entire staff will be involved with the training, Wanakee, Poinet, and at this point we're hoping to bring on board Baraboo possibly as well. And so they're all located south of the Curtis Tension Zone, and that is also part of our strategy to have schools identified north of the Curtis Tension Zone, south of the Curtis Tension Zone, and along the Tension Zone, like for example Door County, so that over the long run we'll be able to work directly as scientists with local schools and communities to validate our observations through data collection. This is just some pictures from year one. As you can see, this is the entire staff, and in fact the tall young man in the middle is now mayor of Park Falls. It's kind of shocking. He's only 27 years old, very bright young man, but we really are anticipating as a direct result through his political activity in the community, we've really has given us a very strong understanding of the importance of bringing community leaders together. And so from our perspective, this has been a really ideal relationship. Not only do we have a trained Globe teacher, but we also have the mayor of one of the local communities who is very actively engaged in this process. And the lower picture leads me into one of our other goals for our project long term, and that is to be able to enhance the science that our scientists at Space Science and the Center for Climate Research do. And this is the Wisconsin Public Television Tower, the lower picture site, where we will literally, as I'm speaking, they're kicking off a NSF-funded project called Cheesehead. And this is the tower site where you saw us on the ground, and you'll see this here as well. Professor Ankur Desai from the Center for Climate Research is the principal investigator on this project. It is a multi-year, $1 million project funded through NSF. Our students who have now gone through 1 year of data collection and our teachers in the Butternut and Park Falls School District will be authentically supporting this project. They were not funded to have soil scientists on board. We will have 19 towers surrounding the portable towers surrounding the primary tower in a 10-kilometer radius that will be on the ground. They've already been deployed, and we will begin data collection next week. Our students will be collecting the soil data to support this project at those 19 sites. And so to us, this is really exciting. This has been our long-term goal. The community will be authentically involved in supporting a National Science Foundation project. The students are incredibly excited about this. If you think about this, they're willing to come into school during the summer. Of course, it's critical we have 2 teachers who are also willing to come into school and work as teams to go to these sites and collect data for the project. But as a community, as a direct result, they're gaining a better understanding. Their 6th, 7th, 8th grade students, high school students, they will be able to look at the data they've collected, and over time, over their lifetimes, when they're sitting around this table, hopefully with gray hair like the rest of us, have really gained an appreciation from a data-driven perspective as to what is happening to their environment and adapt over the next several decades at the community level to better live within that environment and respect the surrounding plant and animal species that are critical to their community. They're historically have been very dependent on the timber industry, and there is some understanding that adaptation will be required. Hunting, the understanding of changes in animal species that the students are already observing. This was interesting that in particular, observations of animal species, I think those of you who have children and grandchildren know, children generally love animals, and this is a real wonderful way to engage them in the process. But from the perspective of bringing this to the classroom, they're looking at atmospheric changes in the water bodies surrounding their community, and they're able to interrelate this and see what is happening locally as a system. They see Earth as a system. And I think with that, just a little bit of, we're also just really surprised at the level of media coverage we've gotten from this. NSF will actually be sending someone from their media office out this summer to Park Falls and Butternut because they recognize this is really a model for how a national agency can work with the community at a very local level. And it really is the only model we have for the future. We, as small communities gathering in groups like this, need to recognize that we need to pull together as small communities. And what we can do as the elders in the community is recognize the importance of science and data and bring that to the classroom so that this is no longer a debate as to whether or not climate change is real. The consensus is not based, once again, on, gee, I think this looks reasonable, so therefore the climate is changing. This is based on a consensus by 98% of the community and the data that has been collected. So, with that, any questions? Any questions? Yes. I'll let